In the pages of history, there are few symbols as powerful and meaningful as war flags. From the blood-soaked battlefields of antiquity to the contemporary theatres of conflict, they have at times represented both the best and worst of humankind. Let's dig into the history and importance behind the flags, with all the triumphs, tragedies, and lasting impacts they have had. First off, what exactly is a war flag? In the simplest terms, a war flag is usually a variant of a standard national flag, used by the country's military forces during a campaign. The nautical equivalent is usually known as a naval ensign. However, today few countries actually have proper war flags, as most prefer to use their standard national flag for this purpose, a trend which began in the 1800s and accelerated over the next centuries. That being said, war flags have a long history and featured in major conflicts for thousands of years. Their original usage may have evolved from field signs, a part of a combatant's clothing used to show their affiliation and difference from enemy forces. There is evidence that field signs were used in early warfare at least since the Bronze Age, making them one of the oldest-running military practices. Experts have argued that the idea of a war flag or battle standard emerged from this tradition, possibly emerging in multiple areas at once. As human civilizations grew in size and complexity, these standards of battlefield affiliation spread and likely morphed into war flags, both as a symbol of nationalism and pride and as a practical way to distinguish larger forces from those of the enemy. The first historically confirmed use of flags as field signs was on the Indian subcontinent and what is today China. According to Britannica, Wu Wang, the founder of the Zhou dynasty in China 1046 to 256 BCE, had a white flag carried before him wherever he went, and records show that in 660 CE, a minor prince was punished for failing to lower his standard before his superior. This points to the strong emphasis on deference that emerged with the use of war flags, where a raised standard could be taken as a serious insult or challenge to a leader's authority. Chinese flags from this period had distinct devices, such as a red bird, a white tiger, or a blue dragon. They were carried on chariots and painted upon the walls of captured cities as a way of laying claim to military conquests. The royal flag, however, instead contained the symbols of kingship, being identified with the ruler himself and treated with a similar respect and deference. Because of this extreme symbolism, it was considered a crime even to touch the flag bearer, and since the fall of the flag meant defeat, a king or emperor would rarely expose his flag and would usually keep it far away from himself. Instead, the flags were normally entrusted to a general, which also may have advanced the tradition of flags being used during wartime. War flags had equal importance in ancient India, and were often carried on chariots and elephants. The flag was the first object of attack in battle, and its fall would mean confusion if not outright defeat for friendly forces. Unlike those of ancient China, Indian flags were often triangular in shape and scarlet or green in color, with a figure embroidered in gold and a gold fringe. Experts have speculated that both Chinese and Indian war flags had a common origin in the standards of ancient Egypt and Assyria, which then spread west into Europe and east into Central and Southern Asia. This possibility is supported by the fact that some Indian flagstaffs were mounted by a figure similar to that displayed on the flag itself. However, in Mughal India, for instance, other emblems of authority were often raised besides the flag, especially yak's tails and what was known as the state umbrella. Also, similarly to China, ancient Indian war flags seem also to have been used for signaling, and there is a recorded instance of a white flag being used as a signal for a truce as early as 1542 CE. Over the course of several centuries, Indian and Chinese usage of war flags spread to Myanmar, Siam, now Thailand, and other parts of Southeastern Asia. Flags with a background of white, yellow, or black silk are mentioned by historians from this era, with elephants, bulls, or water hens embroidered on them in gold. A Siamese treatise on war from this era gives the impression that the flags were unfurled as the march began, so they could represent the military during the entire campaign. Flags were most likely transmitted to Europe by the Saracens, a European term from the Middle Ages, loosely referring to anyone following the religion of Islam. In fact, the Islamic rules against using any identifiable image on the flag considered to be idolatrous likely influenced the changes in their design. Flags are often mentioned in the early history of Islam and may have been copied from India, but Islamic flags are greatly simplified and appear to have been plain black or red or white. Black was supposed to have been the color of vengeance, and of the Prophet Muhammad's banner. A black flag was used by the Abbasid Caliphate in 746 CE, while the later Umayyad Caliphate chose white by contrast. Green was the color of the flag under the Fatimid dynasty, and eventually became the color of Islam. In the Islamic world, as in ancient India and China, war flags were much the same as national flags, since most caliphs were both religious and political leaders engaged in conquest. In Europe, the first national flags were used in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, a practice likely begun through transmission on the Silk Road. Many European leaders of that time adopted the flag of their patron saint to represent their country. In England, for example, the Cross of St. George, still used today, was adopted in the 13th century. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, flags had become accepted symbols of countries, kings, organizations, cities, and guilds. Once flags came into common use, their varieties multiplied throughout Europe, mainly standards, banners, guidons, pennons, and streamers. A standard was the largest and usually marked the position of an important individual before a battle, during a siege, throughout a ceremony, or at a tournament. For the monarch, it was always flown at the place he or she was actually present, and its fall after a battle was synonymous with their personal defeat. Banners such as those widely used during the battles of the Crusades were square or oblong, and meant to be held in battle before royal and noble warriors. The guidon was similar to the standard, but was rounded and had two tails. Guidons were held by leaders in battle who were of lower rank and could not hold a banner. The pennon, a small triangular flag, was carried by each knight on his lance. One purpose of the pennon was to prevent accidents by making lances more visible and show the holder's rank, but also to strike terror into the enemy during a charge. Finally, the streamer was a long flag, used mainly at sea, which came to distinguish warships from the merchant vessels. This practice began with navies, but eventually spread to pirate ships as well, who would hoist their signature black or red streamers to strike fear into enemies and show that they would give them no mercy. As sea-based warfare became more and more widespread in the following centuries, nautical flags also took on their own special significance and rules, often tied to the geopolitics of the day. Striking or lowering the flag came to denote surrender, and the flag of one country being placed above that of another showed the victory of the former. Because of this, in peacetime, it became an insult to hoist the flag of one friendly nation above that of another. Each national flag must be flown from its own flagstaff, and to show honor and respect, a flag is dipped. Ships at sea salute each other by dipping or running the flag slowly down the masthead and then replacing it. When troops parade before a national leader or officer, the regimental flags are lowered as they salute. A flag flying at half-mast also became a nearly universal symbol of mourning, a practice which began at sea, and it became common for ships to signal distress by hoisting their national flag upside down. Many of these practices remain today, especially in navies around the world, building on a long history of symbolism tied to warfare. Some national flags and war flags also became symbols of ideologies as much as movements, giving them power and symbolism far beyond national borders. During the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, the Confederate States of America began using its first flag, the Stars and Bars. After the First Battle of Bull Run, when similarity between the Stars and Bars and the Union Stars and Stripes made it difficult for troops to distinguish friend from foe, Confederate commanders adopted a new flag. In November 1861, the first Confederate battle flags were issued, using the now infamous Southern Cross pattern, with 13 stars representing the pro-slavery states which seceded. Despite the eventual Confederate loss, the flag remains a common symbol in the US South to this day, and is highly controversial for its associations with ideologies based in racism, white supremacy, and slavery. During the 20th century, the relationship between war flags and ideologies became even clearer. One of the most enduring and potent of these was the flag of the Soviet Union, which would become synonymous with the broader, global movement of communism. In the years following the Russian Revolution of 1917, Vladimir Lenin led the adoption of the new flag, a red banner with two communist symbols displayed, a gold hammer and sickle, topped off by a gold 5-point star. The flag's design and symbolism are derived from several sources, but emerged during the Russian Revolution as a nod to past socialist movements. In the century since, the hammer and sickle has also come to serve as the standard symbol representing communism as a whole, recognized around the world, even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The plain red flag, which was a traditional revolutionary symbol long before 1917, was incorporated into the Soviet flag to pay tribute to the international aspect of the so-called Workers' Revolution. However, the unique hammer and sickle design was a modern industrial touch adopted from leaders in the Russian Revolution. They claimed it represented the victorious and enduring Revolutionary Alliance by unifying the hammer, representing workers, and the sickle, representing peasants. The gold-bordered 5-point star situated above the hammer and sickle was a representation of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. As with other flags of the same era, the Soviet flag came to represent an entire worldview and system of government, as well as the industrial and military power behind the USSR. And as the 20th century increasingly became defined by global conflicts, nationalism, and ideological struggle, the Soviet flag was defined in opposition to the greatest threat of the day: fascism. The surge of fascist movements in the 1920s and 30s would produce some of the world's most hated and recognizable flags. Chief among these was the flag of Nazi Germany, featuring a black swastika design on a red background. The word swastika comes from the Sanskrit svastika, which means good fortune or well-being, and the symbol appears to have been first used in Eurasia as early as 7,000 years ago. To this day, it is a sacred symbol in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and other religions. However, the symbol experienced a resurgence in the 19th century as a result of growing European interest in the ancient civilizations of the Near East and India. Unfortunately, the work of linguists and other scholars was taken up by racist groups, for whom the swastika was a symbol of so-called Aryan identity and German nationalist pride. This conjecture of Aryan cultural descent of the German people is likely one of the main reasons why the Nazi Party formally adopted the swastika as its symbol in 1920. As a symbol, it became associated with the idea of a racially pure state. By the time the Nazis gained control of Germany, the connotations of the swastika had become those of racism, anti-Semitism, and hyper-nationalism. The swastika became the most recognizable symbol of Nazi propaganda, appearing on the flag referred to by Hitler in Mein Kampf, as well as on election posters, armbands, medallions, and badges for military and other organizations. After Adolf Hitler took power in 1933, the swastika became widely recognized, striking terror into Jews and others deemed enemies of Nazi Germany. After the outbreak of World War II following Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, this was also joined by a war flag designed by Hitler himself, the so-called Reichskrieg flag, which fused elements of the Nazi with that of the old Imperial Reich war flag, 4 arms emanating from an off-center circle and iron cross in the canton. This flag was hoisted daily in barracks operated by units of the Wehrmacht Combined Military Forces, and it had to be flown from a pole positioned near the barracks entrance, or failing this, near the guardroom or staff building. Collectively, these 2 flags would come to represent the evils of fascism, militarism, and the Holocaust, universally recognizable to any viewing them. By the end of the war, the swastika would become so reviled that following Nazi Germany's defeat in 1945, it would be banned by the Allied governments occupying the nation. Subsequent German governments continued the ban on Nazi symbols and propaganda, including the swastika. Even today in Germany and other European states, public display of Nazi symbols, including on the internet, is prohibited by law, with violation being a criminal offense. However, much like the Soviet hammer and sickle, the swastika would go on to be adopted by neo-Nazi groups around the world, becoming a global symbol of the violent, racist ideology and a throwback to a time of total war. Much as the Soviet and Nazi flags came to represent global ideologies during the Second World War, the flag of the United States also became deeply representative of global liberalism. Before World War II, it was most often raised to oppose US involvement in foreign conflicts, but that changed following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. As the US declared war, the American flag was used to rally and inspire the nation in a time of crisis. On the battlefield and the home front, the flag was cast as symbolizing the values and freedoms the nation was fighting for. Among the most famous of these is a poster from the Office of War, showing an image of the tattered flag flying at half-staff, evoking the nation's grief and outrage after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and urging Americans to channel those emotions into action. And while each branch of the US military and even high-ranking officials have their own flags, many of which were created around the time of the Second World War, It was the Stars and Stripes, which came to represent the US's unified front against fascism. So while the military strength of the US armed forces transformed the American flag into a symbol of freedom and power abroad, the federal government also depended on the flag to mobilize and sustain support for the war at home. Posters, billboards, magazines, and movies waved the Star-Spangled Banner to urge Americans to buy bonds, boost industrial production, ration and recycle, and make other personal sacrifices for the greater good of the war effort. Such appeals linked the flag not only to a sense of loyalty, but to shared cultural values, casting the war as a struggle to defend the American way of life against the rising forces of totalitarianism. By the end of the war, the flag had become the emblem of the world's foremost superpower, in addition to embracing liberal internationalism and capitalism. But the symbolism of the flag forged during World War II was also challenged by the realities of racism and inequality in the country and its military. The same flag hoisted above liberated Nazi camps in Europe also flew over internment camps in the western United States, where Japanese Americans were imprisoned by executive order from 1942 until the end of the war. And even the American GIs who fought together under the flag still served in racially segregated units. Because of these harsh realities during the war, African Americans and other minority groups used the Stars and Stripes not only to display patriotism, but to call attention to these injustices and claim their equal rights as American citizens. The linking of national flags with both conflict and international ideology continued into the Cold War, with the Soviet hammer and sickle and the US Star-Spangled Banner representing a global struggle between capitalism and communism. While the two superpowers would never fight each other directly, their flags became synonymous with global competition and the threat of nuclear war. At much the same time, the end of European colonialism led to huge numbers of new flags being developed by newly independent countries. Many times these also functioned as de facto war flags, as formerly colonized peoples rallied around them during wars of independence and used them to create a new sense of national pride. The Algerian flag, for instance, was featured extensively during the country's bloody war of independence from France. Its use began even earlier, with Algerian nationalist leader Ahmed Messali Hadj, who used the green and white flag in the 1920s as a rallying point for those opposed to French rule. In the 1950s, the National Liberation Front and the National Liberation Army gave support to that flag, which became a symbol of rejection of the French tricolor. When the war finally ended after 8 long years, the flag was finally raised over an independent Algeria on July 3, 1962. For those who fought colonial control after World War II, much like the US nearly 2 centuries earlier, war flags transitioned into national flags, becoming a representation of the new country's values and strength. This also coincided with the blurring of lines between civilians and soldiers that began during World War II and continued afterwards, as entire populations became part of the war effort, and national flags came to represent both the battlefield and the home front. Even today, flags remain closely associated with both war and resistance. For instance, following the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, several people created the idea of the new white-blue-white Russian flag. Kai Katunina, a Berlin-based designer and a Russian-based art manager with the pseudonym Fish Sounds, are each credited with having created the flag. It was first used on social media on 28th of February 2022 and has been flown by Russian expatriates at various anti-war protests. One of the stated reasons for replacing the red stripe of the flag of Russia by a white one is to remove the association with blood and violence. One of the flag's creators stated that the red on the modern flag is associated not just with blood, but with its military power and authoritarian strength. So this is not just the removal of blood, but most importantly, the removal of the cult of militarism and violence. WBR is a historical authoritarian flag introduced by Tsarist Russia. It's also associated with militarism with Russian imperial cause. From the Bronze Age until the present, flags have been a crucial part of military campaigns, inspiring soldiers, creating national pride, and representing countries and movements with potent symbolism. But what do you think? How important are flags to modern war efforts or resistance to them? And what can they tell us about the evolution of conflict? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.